Epilogue. Cameron recovers and catches up with Cecil. The next morning, Cameron arose with a fresh state of vigor and was ready to tackle the growing list of errands he had planned. Suddenly, the phone rang. Cameron attempted to reach it, stumbling slightly in the badly lit room. It was the soft, familiar voice of Cecil, but her voice sounded different, as if it were deeper than usual, although her tone was still recognizable. He was surprised that she was calling him, rather than waiting for him to call her. Nonetheless, they had a productive, genial conversation, which they caught up on what the other had been missing the past couple of weeks since their last meeting. They agreed to meet again in one of the cafes in downtown West Plainsville. Cecil knew of a pleasant, modest spot where they could escape the usual din of the city. The next morning, Cameron peeped out of his second-story window. West Plainsville was not its typical rowdy, disruptive self. It was instead a particularly agreeable that day, with the blood-red sun peeking over the high rises of the city, pouring out a scattered array of sunlight and contrasting with the shadows. It was so commonplace, yet extraordinary at the same time. There was this untouched beauty to the place among the ablated cobblestone streets, not one that could be described in impartial, technical language or through any kind of logical thinking. It was simply a gorgeous sight to be enjoyed, without pretense. Around noon, they met up as they had agreed. Cameron dressed in loose clothing rather than the tight collared shirt and ties he was required to wear at work. Cecil looked modestly stunning as usual, not trying to bring attention to herself, in a casual light dress. As they sat down in an empty booth, Cameron observed, It's been a couple of weeks, but it feels like it's been months since we last talked." He was folding his hands together somewhat compulsively. "Maybe that's a good thing. It could mean that we've both been anticipating it so much that the wait feels longer. I don't know," she said calmly, her natural tenor voice putting Cameron at ease. "Well, I can't deny that," Cameron admitted, blushing slightly. "I have a hard time keeping it all in or telling lies, even little white ones. If I keep it all bottled up and I end up losing my mind, I guess you could say I lay my cards on the table too easily." "That's not a negative thing at all. Honesty is a good trait to have. So you seem a lot better, if you don't mind my saying so. Last few times we talked, there seemed to be something on your mind, like something weighing you down. Now, I know it's not my place to judge your life for what you've been going through. Whatever it is, I'm just glad you're better," Cecil said, understandingly, brushing her hair to the side when trying to find the right words to describe her presentiments. "You're right. I am a lot better. I feel the best I've been in a while, and you wouldn't believe the things I've been through. It's like coming out of a dream in some way." Cameron took a deep breath and exhaled to ease the nerves that had become tense when he recalled these matters. Dream. That word conjures up a myriad of conflicting forebodings without one clear, precise answer to any of them. Was not this very moment a dream too? The old words of Mr. Tiberius rose within him like a familiar echo. It brought Cameron's doubts and fears to the forefront. And did he really wish to invoke such unsettling nightmares in front of her, of all people? "That's great. Mental health is every bit as important as physical health. How can anyone manage in a world if their mind isn't set in order? So tell me more, if you don't mind, about what's been agitating you." Cecil's comments made Cameron a little less anxious as he took another deep breath, looked up at the wall and beyond him, noticing the menu written in colored chalk, finding a cartoonish scribble that ever so slightly resembled an eyeball. This didn't seem to help his case in the least, but he managed to regain his composure and respond. "Well, to put it simply, there was something weighing me down. Doubts, insecurity, fears, and dread, all neatly packaged together in a little hazardous, incendiary device that could have gone off at any moment. Classic ticking time bomb. Do you remember what I told you about all these thoughts and ideas that swarmed into me one day as if I was speaking somebody else's thoughts and how I could hardly tell the difference between reality and dream anymore?" Cecil nodded eagerly, resting her head in her hands. Cameron continued. "There was something really bugging me these past few months, to put it as simply as I possibly can. A character of some kind that got into my head and really messed with me. Not everything he did was so bad. Sometimes he'd tell jokes or give long, insightful, energetic dialogues about anything from drama to the study of archaeology or butterflies. He was a real polymath. But he got out of control and tried to take over my brain, and even forced me to join his vision of making every conscious person a member of some holistically shared mind. I know it sounds insane, but I'm only trying to be honest, like you said. To cut a long story short, I took back control of my life after avowing my resistance and calling him crazy, though I can't say he was entirely evil per se. Then he disappeared into the cracks of the ground after a huge column of smoke covered him, and the ground opened up around him and swallowed him up. This is where things get really tricky. I'm not sure if he died, or if such things are even possible in his world, or if his consciousness assimilated into a frequency of divine light filled with hymnal singing and iconoclastic thinkers, as he described it. Oh, that's right. He also put on this ridiculous theater show on a giant stage where he grew bigger and bigger and mocked me in front of these crowds of these creepy, faceless people. It was nauseating. It was at that point that he just upped and vanished into a plume of smoke, and I hadn't seen him since. Now that it's all over, I feel safe. I feel like once I took control over my life, he could no longer exercise control over me, so he had to leave. There's nothing going on inside me that I think isn't being properly dealt with. Am I perfect? Of course not. And I'd be the first to admit that. But I feel like a load has been taken off my shoulders, and that's good enough for now. I haven't seen him since then, so my fingers are crossed. Now all I can do is wait. Cecil adopted a look of such obvious shock and fright that Cameron worried he had startled her. Well, I don't know what to take of all this. It's quite the story, she said with an expression that hinted at disbelief, worry. Oh my, sorry, Cecil, I didn't mean to come off as crazy, but only try to be open with you. I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I held this all in. That's not a healthy way to go about the world, in my opinion. Listen, I know it sounds like I have some condition, like schizophrenia or something. Even crazier, I've seen this thing walk around town, too. I'm fine being pegged as crazy, but I know what I saw. The doctor I last talked to said I wasn't showing any sign of madness or delirium, only minor issues with diet or sleep, and you can take his word for what it is. All I know is that I saw these things. Some of it was breathtaking. Other times it was desperately unsettling, even grotesque. If you could just at least entertain the possibility of what I'm saying. Cameron was nearly ecstatic, but holding himself together the best he could, given the circumstances. Cecil still looked at him with the same expression of bewilderment, but finally spoke in a faltering, hushed voice, sounding equally shocked. I think I know exactly what you're talking about. I may have seen the same thing. Was it a giant eyeball, by any chance? Cameron nearly dropped his mug in disbelief. Yes, a creature with an eyeball for a head, wearing 19th century formal attire, he exclaimed in elatedness and trepidation, but not without realizing the comedy of his statements, which drew the curious looks of other customers. Exactly, she shouted, also alarming some of the patrons. Then she blushed and lowered her voice. Where was this? You have to tell me all about it, Cameron inquired anticipatingly. Well, I was walking back from work one day, and I was about to stop by the pharmacy when I passed by a dark, empty alleyway in which there was a drainage system. I didn't think much about it until I heard the most unsettling laughter come from the direction of where the sewage went into the ground. I looked to see where it came from, but saw only the brief shadow of something which I thought to be a cat or some animal. I was on the verge of leaving when I heard a second round of laughter, and this time a set of steps resounding in the drain. Suddenly, the sewage grate covering the ditch popped off, and I saw it rise from underground into full view. You saw the Eye Man, Mr. Tiberius? Cameron said. Exactly. Except he didn't call himself that. Well, he didn't call himself anything. He just looked at me in the oddest way. He was wearing a long, sequined tailcoat jacket with fancy embroidery, and breeches with a dry corn hat. It was kind of like French directory style. The only reason I know that is because my mother is a seamstress and she did period costumes quite a lot. I'd never seen anything like it. I considered running, but something about it was somewhat enticing, to be honest. He beckoned me over with his gloved hand, which held out a pipe which he lit. I didn't follow, but I did stare for a little while longer. It was difficult to see him more clearly, as it was long after dark and there was only one lamppost. He spoke, with a very proper English accent, the kind that sounded kind of old-fashioned but very eloquent. He said something like, Greetings, little lass. What brings a finely attuned woman of your caliber to this insalubrious end of town? Do you not know that the water flows backward here? Perhaps it flows in both directions. All that was once upside down is now right side up. Correct? I didn't really understand what he was hinting at, but he spoke so fluently that it was hard not to listen. And it put me a bit more at ease, even though the entire scene was so uncomfortable. If he had talked with more of an unrefined or rude manner, or was impatient with me, I would have likely run off. Wow, Cameron said with a gasp. That's out of this world. I can't believe you saw him too. This makes perfect sense. Or maybe it doesn't. Either way, did he say anything else? Cecil immediately drew her hand into her bag and produced a journal, from which she opened and turned the pages until she found her desired location. Yeah, he did turn around, strike up his pipe, and offer me a glass of gin, but I declined. Once he had lit his pipe, he gave me some kind of poetic riddle that went something like, "What flatters men is obsolete, what flatters women is not concrete. Where do birds rest their feet? Are the wonders of this world sights to behold, to compare with the grandeur that lies in one's soul? Even the darkest of sepulchres or sewers, light can still be found. They even abound. Even when confusion reigns, up is still down." Then he gave me a little bow, tipped his tricorn hat, and slipped back into the sewer. I was completely at a loss. I just stood there taking it all in. Now I'm the one who sounds crazy. And believe me, I pinched myself more times than I can count, just to make sure I wasn't daydreaming. I certainly believe that it could have been a fit of the imagination. Who knows? But I think this means something. Personally, I think there's maybe some kind of shared dream or consciousness that we all partake in. I don't know how to describe it. It's really beyond explanation. Cameron looked more and more perturbed, but there was still a light of dignity in her eyes. She was a level-headed enough person not to give in to idle fancy. Cameron was delighted in an odd sort of way, knowing that he was not alone. He did have a knack for riddles and poems, Cameron divulged, staring blankly forward and trying to recall. When I first saw him, I was fully in a dream state, but I did see him appear a couple of times in real life, or what seemed to be real life. He had a certain charisma about him, a hidden brilliance, but a cryptic, foreboding aura that made me very confused about how to take him. He was certainly affable and easygoing, but he never settled in one way of looking at things, and wasn't above hurting people's feelings if he believed himself right. To be one thing and one thing only is a dismal route, or so he would say. He would also always go on these long tangents, sometimes for hours at a stretch. When I voiced my disagreements, he claimed that he was my own personal hell, sent to torment me with confusion, and that later on, that he was everything I failed to be. I don't know how true any of it was. I'm always open to the idea that it could all be a very strange case of collective hysteria, but to see so many correlations, especially with your case, and not to at least admit that there's some connection would seem a bit foolish. So it's confirmed that we've both seen him, said Cecil. What did he want? Before Cameron could answer, she continued. What struck me was the notion that he didn't seem as alarming as you'd think an otherworldly being or a ghost would. Phantoms and bizarre hybrid creatures would scare you senseless, or at least that's what you'd imagine. But the way Mr. Tiberius came across was not frightening. He was simply disconcerting at first glance. But when he spoke, he sounded very reasonable and accommodating. He even offered me a drink. That's more than you can ask of half of West Plainsville. Now, that isn't to say that what you see on the surface, casual, informative oddball who couldn't be more than what he appears, but who knows? I completely agree. He said he wanted some kind of a shared community of minds to join together, Cameron replied, looking around to check to see if anybody was watching. Seeing that most of the restaurant had vacated, he proceeded confidently. Mr. Tiberius spoke a lot about communism, Marxism in particular. He brought up social and economic dialectics, and in that the shared community would abolish all classes, and that everybody would have access and be hooked up in some way to the system, in which everyone would be in a perpetual state of passive calm. He discussed the Enlightenment quite a bit as well. There was so much to his ideas, so many layers and avenues of discussions, that it hurts my head just thinking about it. His mind was infinitely buzzing with new data and concepts. This hive mind required the dream world and reality to fuse together in a cooperative mutual agreement whereby the contents of one's world would navigate seamlessly from one side to the other, and the previous portal, the one I used, would be abolished. He warned me that this process might be fairly disruptive and volatile, and that some fragments of this life would be lost and never found again. That's why he called it a leap of faith, because it demands that you give yourself over wholly to this system without a hint of hesitation. Once an equilibrium was reached, all this dissipated consciousness would join together. Mr. Tiberius claimed to be in some type of organization called the Interdimensional Consulate of Human Affairs that deals with those in need of self-development, inner growth, bargaining with souls, as he put it. I have no idea what the exact nature of the business was like. He only mentioned it in passing. but I reckon that he was involved in time travel to some extent due to his constantly changing wardrobe and the fact that he spoke several languages and seemed to have a grasp on multiple epochs of time, as though his very existence wasn't confusing enough. His persona and nature appeared to survive over countless years, whether it was in an underground sewer system or like the one I fed him, or a village of adobe houses. Cameron spoke extensively about the long conversations he had with Mr. Tiberius and made sure not to leave out any salient details such as the appearances of Mr. Spencer and his dramatic, pessimistic inquiries into his miserable existence, Mr. Hollander and his unconquerable appetite, and inevitable, if unfortunate, explosion. He described his encounter with Mr. Tiberius in the streets of West Blainsville, his standing up against Mr. Singer, and by extension Robin's assumption of power in the office, and a variety of other events that had taken place over the past couple of months. "I don't even know what to say," said Cecil, wiping her brow tensely. "It all sounds so insane, but I just can't write it off. It has to mean something. Like you said, there's just too many coincidences." "So, you compromised his chances of reaching this goal of this hive mind?" "I believe so, yeah," Cameron responded with a sense of confidence. "It could have been all it took of my mind, but I know it's not so easy to write something off as untrue simply because it isn't factually and concretely in front of you. In fact, Mr. Tiberius once put it fluently, though the places I come from are all ludicrous, and my very existence or the thought of it is outlandishly absurd, I am in fact more real than the dismal office walls you occupy or the cheap food you eat." He had a point. He simply took it to extreme measures, and I had to throw in the towel at some point. I can't stay in a dream world forever. I have a life to live here. There are so many things that I cherish in this world. Longingly at Cecil as he said this. After a deep sigh, he continued, "I think the reason I succumbed to his takeover was because I hadn't been paying enough attention to this world here and now, because I was in some ways a foolish and selfish person who didn't prize my life and live it to the furthest extent of my abilities. Most of my career, for the most of my life, I felt shipwrecked, plateaued, and stuck in limbo, and I needed something that outlandish to manifest itself into my head or reality or wherever he came from, and to show me that where I was going wrong and what I needed to change about myself. After all, he did teach me to stand up to the people who were bringing me down in life, and to broaden my understanding of things." After this long, impassioned discourse, Cameron sighed and prepared to continue talking. Suddenly, the distant, indefinite sound of laughter was heard, possibly from the inside or outside. It was difficult to tell. It seemed to emerge from all sides at once. It was a familiar laugh that resounded softly throughout the air, one that was both offsetting and welcoming at the same time, as if it were a peculiar reminder of what had once been. He smiled wistfully and thought nothing more of it. It didn't take long for it to no longer occupy his immediate attention. Instead, he was focused on Cecil. "Anyway, I'm sorry for being so dramatic. I've just had a lot going on recently. There was so much on my mind. As I said, now I'm the best I've ever felt in a long time. Why don't we get some dinner later this week?" "Yes, that sounds like a great idea. I could make that work. After all, you need a break. Remember what I said. You deserve it. Come on. I know of a neat little furniture store around here. I'm in dire need of a new bookshelf. What do you say?" Cameron willingly obliged, and they both walked into the pleasant afternoon air and enjoyed the sights that West Blainsville had to offer. Almost everyone seemed to be in a good mood that day. Was it something in the air that made the unusual shabby city a tad more hospitable? No one knew. But Cameron and Cecil had a long, auspicious relationship ahead of them, and even though events wouldn't be as sunny as it were that particular day, overall, their affection and love for one another only grew, and they learned to live happily and contentedly among that city and enjoyed many years ahead. Every now and then, Cameron would have a brief flashback to those times. An image of him hunched over, recoiling, hiding his face from the mordant gaze of an eye creature haunted him occasionally. A vision of himself attempting to retreat from that all-seeing eye that cast a treacherous penumbra, eclipsing his confidence. However, rather than forcing himself to dispel every last instance of these thoughts, he instead allowed himself to reflect without being held hostage to their whims. He recognized fully what it was within him that rendered him uncomfortable, rather than running from it. He faced it head-on with utmost temerity until it was adequately amended. This certainly was not to say that he had wholly gotten rid of these thoughts, but only that he assimilated them into his frame of reality. In the end, he ultimately let himself make the decisions. It was an arduous thing to master, but it proved rewarding. Every now and then he'd muse briefly on Mr. Tiberius, that madcap, baffling old fool, and think about the long conversations about philosophy, dialectics, ethics, humor, comedy, tragedy, Hellenism, Marxism, ascetic Buddhist thought, Kabbalist mysticism, the art of profanity, and last but not least, the perks of exceptional eyesight. Most assuredly, there were times when Cameron thought, when his presence had proved difficult. His attitude and behavior had erratic, hypocritical, radical, and even destructive, if we define them by worldly terms. The extent Mr. Tiberius had gone in order to strong-arm Cameron into acceding to his plans had been intolerable and officious, to put it lightly. Despite these obvious faults, it would be disingenuous not to admit that he had benefited Cameron immensely in ways he couldn't quite understand in the moment, but came to appreciate later on. To this day, Cameron lives normally. He has put more effort into bettering himself day by day in order to achieve his long-term goals. He quit the law offices of West Plainsville and began working at an assisted living home instead, where he felt his work to be meaningful. It wasn't a dream job by any stretch, but he could see a semblance of his reflection in his job. If he made someone smile, it made his day remarkably brighter. Plus, there was room for advancement in this field, a perk which his later job never graced him. Cameron would sometimes pass the old dual law offices where he had once worked at to see in what little windows they had, the same characters still hammering away at their jobs, as if nothing had changed since he left. Occasionally, he saw Robin, now head of the copying department, in an extravagant, glitzy suit, with a plastered-on smile and the same look of disingenuous, venal effectiveness to him. Sometimes, he'd even see Mr. Singer, now with increasingly gray hair and seeming to have lost a bit of weight, but still the same tenacious, overbearing bulldog of a man. However, Cameron didn't let such moments affect his progress in life. If anything, it fueled his ambitions. Other times, he would chuckle buoyantly with the equanimous enthusiasm of the laughing Buddha Mr. Tiberius had spoken so highly of. His inimitable laugh could be vaguely heard from time to time, and it didn't bother Cameron one bit. For sometimes, when he looked in the mirror, especially a malformed one, he saw his own distorted eyes looking back at him with skewered curiosity, and confidently saw a bit of Mr. Tiberius in himself. And that was quite all right. The end. This concludes A Conversation with the Eye by Andrew Bruff. Read by the author. Text copyright 2021 to 2022. Audio recording copyright 2022 to 2023. Many thanks to Reedsy professionals such as Stephen Guinness for his talents editing, and Rachel Kelly for her amazing contributions to the front cover.